Shivani, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm doing well. It's sunny in LA.
Nice. Awesome. Well, we'll avoid conversations about global pandemics and things like that. But thanks for jumping on with me. I know you're busy. Be great just to tell folks a little bit about your background and how you came to start Tala. I think is always a great place to start.
Yeah, that sounds great. I would say the first thing that I always say is never thought I was going to be an entrepreneur and never thought I was going to start a company. And in some ways, really just, I think I found a problem that I couldn't stop thinking about, and started working on it, and it kind of took on a life of its own. So my background is a mix of investment banking, and then also working at the UN Population Fund. So I started my career in equity research, realized I wanted to do something more impactful, but still within the finance space. And so ended up working in microfinance for a period of time, realized that, while microcredit has been very helpful in creating an impact, I felt like there was still not enough being done to really change how the financial system as a whole really operates to include the underserved. And so what I mean by that is, we don't have traditional credit history data or credit bureau data on the underserved segment, which is about 2 billion people around the world.
Amazing.
And then in addition to that, when we look at the supply chain or the infrastructure for financial products to actually get to the underserved, what we see is a really fragmented system, whether it's from the lack of national IDs existing across emerging markets, or again, the fragmented payment systems that exist. So the majority of the world continues to spend money in cash. And so after that experience, I really went to go find out, how do I get to understand more about the system as a whole and how individuals are interacting with money day to day. And so when I worked at the UN, I had the opportunity to interview a little over 3,500 individuals across 9 different markets.
Time frame, like when was that? When were you working at the UN?
This was probably back in 2006, 2007. Yeah. So it was a long time ago, and had the opportunity to interview individuals and really be proximate to all of their financial decisions. Literally got to walk alongside them as they were buying inventory or deciding which bill to pay, deciding, how much went under a mattress or how much went into a lockbox, and kind of got to understand how they think about hard money versus soft money, and what they're actually putting away versus what is liquid. And I realized that there was an enormous amount of data that was actually sitting right in front of us. So it wasn't sitting in a bureau or a macro database, but it was daily life data. And so then I really became obsessed with, how am I going to find a scalable, seamless source for this information to really prove the potential of this segment. And that's what led me to eventually starting to build our prototype and starting Tala.
And I think when you say there's 2 billion people that are, underbanked, a lot of folks in the US don't understand what that means. But we're talking about people who don't have a bank account. They largely live in a cash economy. They don't have a mortgage. They don't have a credit card. I mean, can you just talk a little bit about, I think in the US, people sort of wake up and they think, oh, there's a Wells Fargo branch down the street, and when I'm 18 and I get a job, I'll create a checking account. Like, what is it like outside the US, and why is this whole, 2 billion people, why haven't they traditionally been served?
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's interesting because I think obviously I am someone that believes in the potential and the ability for us to unlock this massive amount of purchasing power. But it is really, I think, a double-sided problem. So on the one hand, you have financial institutions that are saying, look, it's too costly and it's too risky for me to serve this segment because I don't have the traditional mechanisms to be able to understand their capacity, their risk, as well as really transact with them. And so this kind of gets back to that piece of, only 30% of the adult population worldwide is even covered by a credit bureau. And so there are an enormous amount of people that we just literally do not see. And then in addition to that, again, the fragmented infrastructure that exists doesn't enable a bank to actually cost effectively serve this segment. And so they just essentially are saying, this segment's not for us. And then on the other side, in terms of the consumer problem, because traditional banks don't want to serve this segment or believe it's too risky, then the consumer almost opts out and they continue operating in an informal way, right? But what we know is on both sides, there's opportunity being lost. And so the marketplace just doesn't get to gain from this.
Yeah, it's funny. We funded a company in India that helps people work with gold. A lot of families in India have huge gold reserves, as you know.
Yeah.
And I just think these concepts are foreign to people in the US. And how much of this is driven by sort of, if we think about like the iPhone launch in 08, 09, putting that, device into the hands of people around the world, not that device, but a device, because the physical bank infrastructure, there's no way physical bank infrastructure could have served the 7 billion people in the world. And sort of back to that point about it being cost effective for the banks, but have major banks shifted their view in the last 13 years since we got into smartphones, or is this still massive greenfield opportunity for new and emerging players like Tala?
Yeah, I would say that it's still a massive greenfield opportunity.
The answer.
I mean, we've served over 6 million customers with our first product, which was access to credit. And while we see banks coming downstream a little, what they're doing is still focusing, again, on the prime customer that is underserved versus actually building intentionally, like we have, to get to this massive underbanked segment.
And the potential of this segment, like when you talk about underbanked, it also means they're generally not participating in e-commerce. They're not participating in digital healthcare. Like there's so many things that being out of the banking system prevents you from being a part of. And I know a big part of your mission is to unlock that, right? All the services that go beyond just banking.
Exactly. And I think that it starts with, how do we, again, create that financial identity, right? And how do we really, again, supply our customers with both an identity that is verified, a credit score, longitudinal data on repayments, preference, loan use cases. And then now where we're going is essentially being that full financial partner for them and giving them an account that is safe to then deposit money into and then also transact.
And a lot of folks in the US sort of take for granted, you mentioned credit bureaus. My guess is the majority of the US doesn't understand what credit bureaus do, but we don't generally, people think about the fact that they've been building credit really since the day they got out of college. They started to open a bank account, they started saving money, they started using a credit card. They've been building credit so that when they're in their 30s and they need to go get a mortgage for their first home, it's like, oh, we know who you are, we know what your track record looks like. And so a lot of what you're trying to do, though, is help where that doesn't exist at all, and probably at least won't exist for some period of time, create this digital credit score almost, and give people the chance to jump into the banking universe and have all the benefits that comes with that.
Exactly. And that's how we started, was really focusing in on the first part of the problem, which was the credit scoring aspect, the lack of data on this segment. And then over time, what we realized was actually, it's not just that the data is not there and the credit scores aren't there, because it also takes someone taking the first risk to serve this customer. Again, prove out that purchasing power and that potential. And so I think that's really essentially what changed for Tala. Is like, I thought the problem was only one thing, but actually the problem is the entire supply chain, and actually the willingness, I think, of the industry to go ahead and change their perception on this customer. And so that's why we really are a mission-driven, for-profit organization.
So let's wind back the clock a few years. So you're thinking about, you research this problem when you're at the UN, you see the problem, you're thinking about it, and you take the leap to start this company, which I love your opening. You said, I didn't think I was going to be an entrepreneur. How did you make that leap, and how hard was it? And folks love to hear those kind of early days entrepreneur stories. What were some of the biggest challenges that you ran into when you were trying to get Tala off the ground?
I think, I mean, so one, I'm really saying I did not think that this was going to happen. I started working on it while I was working full time. And so I didn't know that much about, raising capital. Obviously, I worked in investment banking, so I understood you could go raise seed funding, but that wasn't my first approach. So I just used my savings. And I was like, well, I'll just work and and get this thing going on the side, and we'll see, right? Maybe I'll give it to another company or something. But what I also did was I reached out to anyone and everyone that would talk to me to better understand the problem, to better understand if solutions existed. Because again, I was just fueled to solve the problem. So I said, maybe I'll go work at a company that's solving the problem. And so I think I emailed about 750 people on LinkedIn. I think
Wow.
I had a pretty good conversion rate, actually, because I think the reality is that most people actually want to help. And so I ended up amassing this kind of volunteer army of folks, which is about 30 people around the world. All working full time on their real jobs, and then on the side kind of helping me. So kind of realized, hey, I could actually bring together a group of people. I learned how to code and started actually, again, lending my own capital to these customers. So the good thing was, by working at the UN, I did have the connections in these markets to be able to test my idea.
Yep.
But I was sitting here in LA.
Yeah.
And what I mean when I say the company kind of took on a life of its own was, eventually my boss at the time was like, I think you have another job. And so I think that was my moment of realizing that, I did need to make a choice, and that I could.
Yeah.
And I have a really great advisor that's still a part of our board advisory team. And she told me once that, while you're working on this, ensure that you actually have the ability financially, so rent, food, things like that, are taken care of for you for the next 6 months, so that you, again, as a woman entrepreneur, can go and do this without any dependencies. And so I think those two things kind of clicked, and I took the leap.
And then early on, I know you raised some money. So talk about that. And this is not an easy idea for a lot of investors in the US to understand, right? You're serving markets in Kenya, and I mean, you can talk more about where you're serving today, but they're markets that most people in the US don't understand.
Yep.
And it's not like you're a repeat founder. So you're walking in with this story. So what was it like raising that initial capital early on? It couldn't have been easy.
So I took a different approach than most. I would say I did two things. The first is, again, really just continued to focus on the problem, but started to understand that you could raise capital through business plan competitions, through fellowships. And so I raised about, I believe at that time, about $200,000 or $300,000 to just kind of keep on doing this and get an initial team in place. From there, once we got to about 10,000 customers, at that point, it was like, okay, I feel comfortable sharing more on this idea. So started getting on Twitter, started, joining other fellowships like the TED Fellowship, and honestly, opportunistically, ended up sharing my idea with one of our seed investors who led our round. And I think he was kind of shocked, because I really didn't know who he was, and really just, again, was telling him my life story, what I was working on. And I think probably saw the passion and realized, like, hey, maybe there's something here, and also saw the opportunity. And from there, we raised our seed round, I believe, in the next 30 days. So we raised about $1.2 million. And that's really when things started to shift. But you're totally right. The idea of using mobile phone data to develop a credit score for the underserved and lend to them based on that, sitting in Los Angeles, was pretty out there.
Yeah. And I think notably, it wasn't like you spent a bunch of time marching up and down Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley to try and raise capital. You raised money from Chris and a number of other folks who, I think one of the most powerful things, and you mentioned the idea that people actually wanted to help. I think one of the amazing vibes in tech is, if you build something really interesting and it's very clear that you are dedicated to it and focused on it and believe in it and have a mission behind what you're doing, it's amazing the number of people that will rally around you, not just with capital, but with introductions and help. I mean, you and I originally met, I think, through Peter Pham. So it's just, I think it's such a great talking point for folks who are trying to think of, should I start a company? And it's like, well, if you do, and you're really passionate and focused, and you're actually building something, the fact that you kind of bootstrapped it to 10,000 customers is also pretty amazing. That doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes, we get so caught up in, who's investing and the round itself and the dynamics there that we almost lose sight of, what it is that we're looking to do, right? And to solve. And so in some ways it allowed me to have that tunnel vision because I didn't even think that was a possibility. And so when it happened, it was kind of like, oh, okay, I can take this to the next level. And that's what you really want when you're thinking about venture capital, right? Is how do I actually really focus on getting this now accelerated as opposed to, I think, just starting many times.
Yeah. So you get through the early days, you launch the business, it's clearly working, or at least clear to you and some of the other folks around the table. What was it like kind of scaling from, call it maybe 10 to 100 people? And then maybe talk a little about where you guys are today, the operation of the business around the world. And then I want to jump into last year, which was such a crazy year for every entrepreneur. And I want to talk a little about your experience there, but just talk a little about what it was like scaling after you raised those first few rounds of capital and scaling a distributed team all over the world. Because you were doing that before most. I mean, now everybody's like, oh, we're global, but like most companies weren't 5 years ago when you were.
Yeah, no, it's true. In some ways, maybe we were more prepared for the pandemic than most. So we have an office here in the US, and then we operate across 4 countries. So we're in Kenya, the Philippines, Mexico, Mexico, and India. And we're 450 people now globally, and we have offices in each of those markets. And I think that first piece of going from 10 to 100, luckily we did focus that initially in just one market. And so we weren't naive in the sense of saying, let's launch, 4 countries at once. So we really proved it out in one market, proved that the business model was profitable, that this customer actually could be served using this proprietary supply chain that we developed and credit models that we developed. And then from there, we said, okay, intentionally, how do we build our playbook to go from our first market, Kenya, to the Philippines? And when I say intentionally, I think we tried, but at the same time, what we realized when we launched there were definitely mistakes and key assumptions that, we didn't even think about. Which again, then enabled us to, again, refine that. And so then we went to the next market, which was Mexico. And so I guess my thing is, the thing we've always done well is always kind of question ourselves. Mm-hmm. And one of our founding principles is really around listening and learning. Because at the end of the day, it's really, if you're not listening to your markets, our markets, emerging markets in particular, and this customer base, there's a lot of volatility. There's a lot changing all at once, which is both really exciting. But at the same time, if you're so dogmatic about this particular solution or this particular way of doing it, you're going to, again, lose sight of some of the opportunities that are starting to change in front of us. And so I think that's been a key piece of, I think, what's allowed us to adapt as we've grown and also how we navigated the pandemic.
Amazing. And so the business grows, you're doing great. The pandemic hits. Yeah. This is January, February, March of last year. Just share with folks sort of what happened, because in the markets, most folks in the US have exposure to what happened in the US, but they don't have a lot of exposure to what's happened with COVID around the world. Maybe just talk a little about what happened and then I'll jump in a little more around team and culture, because there was so much that you had to deal with as a founder and a CEO that I think it'd be great to share with some folks.
Yeah, well, I mean, coming into the pandemic, I guess the first thing I'll say is that, it's kind of one of those like very much like, getting punched, because we had our first quarter of 2020 was one of the best quarters we've ever had as a company in all of Tala history. And so we were just like beating expectations on the growth side, our margins, it was just like everything was working and we were so psyched. We're in the process of closing some really key executives that joined the team. But, it's like, as a founder, I'm like, all right, this is great. 2020 is going to be great. And then March 16th, our first market goes into lockdown. And that was the Philippines. And so for us, I think maybe the beauty of being a global company is we actually saw this coming. And so because of the fact that we saw the Philippines go into lockdown, we were able to make some very quick moves to really ensure that we didn't face losses on the credit side. And so we turned approval rates down and really got a handle on the situation. And I think what's exciting is like, we didn't actually face any losses by the end of the year. So we recovered 100% of what was out there at that time. The next thing we did was say, okay, this is happening in the Philippines. It's going to happen everywhere. And so within 2 days, we actually took the entire team globally remote. And again, because we were already global and in a sense remote from headquarters or the US office, we actually lost no business continuity. And then what we did in the next 2 weeks was say, okay, now that we've ensured that we're not going to face losses, right? Nothing new is going to affect us. How do we essentially start to rethink our product, the value that we can provide to our customers, and the relationships that we have in our markets during this time? So we rebuilt our entire payments infrastructure in 2 weeks to allow for flexibility or any changes that governments may be making in terms of extensions or write-offs. And so we allowed for that. We then got on the phone, we talked with our customers, we messaged with them. We essentially said, Tala is here for you, and so how do we better understand what they're going through? I always think of it as like, at the end of the day, what Tala is doing is really proving the trust feedback loop. And so you need to be able to show your customers that you're there for them so that they can then tell you how to serve them during this time. Or really for us to understand mobility, capacity, what's changing. And so I think the key things in terms of what helped us navigate the pandemic was, one, we focused on ensuring no losses. So the second thing was, again, this idea of learning and listening. And so we doubled down on tech and product and really said, we're going to launch a bunch of experiments and new products at this time. And then the third piece really was around, again, changing our operating philosophy a little bit in terms of saying, once this pandemic's over, we don't want to lose everything that we actually did to navigate it. And so how do we ensure that we can really control our own destiny? And so a lot of that went into how we rethink the business model as well.
And a testament to you guys then had a great, back half of the year, and this year's is awesome. I think it's one of the hidden secrets of what happened last year, the resiliency of so many tech companies, is people did what you did, which is they hunkered down, they kind of focused on what mattered, and then they launched a whole bunch of products and services that are now, providing huge tailwinds for their businesses today. From a personal level, what were the hardest things for you last year? Maybe just to the extent you're willing to share, what were the things you went through as a founder and a CEO that were hard for you? Because I think it's, one, it's important for people to hear, other entrepreneurs, but two, I also think we're going to look back in 5 or 10 years and realize that we built better companies because of the resiliency that, we built during this time period. So just maybe anything that comes to mind for you, things that were challenges for you personally?
I mean, so much. I think, I am definitely an optimistic person. And I think at the end of the day, I guess, maybe the best compliment I've ever gotten is that in some ways I'm a cockroach. I'm not going to lie. I think, and that was our spirit animal. I told our team that, right when we went into the pandemic, that right now it is not about, being a phoenix. Right now, it's really about resiliency. And cockroaches can withstand even nuclear attacks.
Right.
And so we are going to come out of this. And I think, as lame as that is, or funny as that is, we had a channel in Slack that was called that. And it was called Cockroach Mindset. And literally it was everything that we could think of in terms of what else can we cut costs in? What else can we be doing? And it was this kind of scrappy mentality, I think, that, I really tried to ensure that our team could take on. And another analogy was like our GM in the Philippines said, we're going to be the last shrimp boat standing, right? And so we had these kinds of things that, again, culturally were fueling us. Right. And that's what led, I think, to that second half of 2020 being, again, one of the best in our history. Personally, on my end, I think we as a team are also really bonded because of in-person interaction. That was pre-COVID, right? If you came into our office, you could just sort of viscerally feel the passion for our customers and really essentially like the bonds that our team had with each other. And that wasn't just in the US, it was across our markets. And so I think not having that even during COVID is what made it really hard. So we weren't able to translate a lot of the kind of quick, decisive moves that we needed to make on the strategy side in this kind of in-person way, because we just had to move. And so a lot of it is, how do you essentially trust your leadership team without necessarily needing to just see them physically all the time?
Yeah.
And so that's a lot of what we've had to learn is, how do we rethink our communication? And then lastly, during the pandemic, I was also pregnant with twins. And so went into it, obviously knowing that, but I think that was the other piece of, how much can I share? Because I know Matt Lee would be coming, but didn't want to also, have the team feel like, hey, our CEO is also going to leave for a period of time. And so, yeah, I think it was really, in some ways, awesome for me as a leader, because I learned how to be more authentic and how to essentially share my own vulnerabilities, in terms of what I was navigating personally. And so, yeah.
Amazing. I mean, I just can't, it's such a crazy year for so many people, and to build an amazing company, have the twin. I mean, it's just, and so talk a little about where you guys are today and where Tala is going, because I think the future is pretty exciting.
Yeah. Again, I think what we did best was that we listened to our markets. So, we had always had a vision of moving beyond credit, really focusing on accelerating financial agency for the underserved. And when we think about agency, we think about it as three things. It's how customers use money, protect money, and grow money. But this, as a startup, even though you've got that big vision, sometimes you're just still so focused on that first product that you launch, and perfecting it, refining it. And so we kind of knew we needed to move beyond it, but there wasn't that forcing function.
Yeah.
COVID actually gave it to us, right? What we saw was that our customers physically could not go pick up cash or transact in cash any longer, right? All of the remittance centers, bill payment centers they were locked. And so customers literally could not travel. We're not mobile. And so we said, okay, now's the time. We have to. And so we launched the full Tala account across Mexico and now also in the Philippines, giving our customers the ability to actually get their cash in a mobile account from Tala, receive remittances, deposits, save with Tala, and then also now have a debit card product that they can physically and virtually transact with. And so that's what we're going after now, is really being that full financial account and partner for our customers. And so we're super excited to bring it across our 4 markets in the coming year.
I think it's crazy that there's 2 billion people that don't have that today. That is such a basic thing that we all take for granted. Multiple credit cards and ATM cards and bank accounts and savings and brokerage. 2 billion people don't have any of that. And that's the opportunity set ahead for you guys, which is so cool.
Totally. And I think it's, how do you give them the functional tools like we're talking about? But I also think of this as, it is also about the emotional aspect. And I think that's what we're focused on, is really, again, bringing back the emotion behind money, which does exist, but a lot of us don't talk about it, right? It's personal. And so you really do need to start from a place of the customer trusting you, especially when we think about the underserved, for them to then again on-ramp into the financial system.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for hours, so we only budgeted a half an hour. But I love the Tala story. I've loved it since the day we met. I think that one of the fun things about our firm, obviously, is we're global. I think so many people in the US don't understand how big these opportunities are outside the US and how empowering it is, right? Like you said, it's an emotional thing to give somebody access to a financial system. And I love what you're doing. I love that it's been your mission since day one. And I think I'm a big believer that good people win in the end. So I'm very confident Tala is going to win. So thanks for spending time with me.
definitely. Thanks again.
Thanks, Shivani. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.